Hello, it's Professor Buzzkill. The other night I went to see Born on Third Base, the new stand-up comedy show by Gary Gulman, who's one of my favorites. Rather than just tell jokes, Gulman organizes his new shows around a theme. The theme for Born on Third Base was empathy, and Gulman did a masterful job of weaving it through his humorous stories and gags. He did it in such a way that I hope the audience left happy and in a good mood from laughing, but I also hope they were thinking about some of the more important things that Gulman was discussing. These included empathy towards families who are struggling financially, empathy towards service workers making minimum wage and having to deal with customers with superiority complexes, and empathy towards many, many other groups of people. Gulman referred to Pastor Martin Niemöller's famous quote, "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist," end quote, using it as a thematic hook. And it made me think about the show we did about this quote a few years ago. So I wanted to have an encore today as a Wisdom Wednesday show. I hope you find it interesting. But I also hope that you'll pay attention to the fact that we happen to be living through a period that's particularly rich in thoughtful and deep-thinking comedians who also, of course, happen to be hilarious. And we're pretty lucky to be able to listen to, for instance, Maria Bamford, Mike Kaplan, Mike Birbiglia, and, of course, Gary Gulman, among others. I encourage you to look out for Gulman's Born on Third Base when it comes out in audio format in the near future. It'll make you think. And I hope the following encore presentation of our show on First They Came For will also make you think.
We shall never surrender.
One small step for man.
I have a dream.
Those who do not know real quotes are condemned to repeat bogus quotes. Let's join Professor Buzzkill for Quote or No Quote.
Usually on these quote or no quote episodes, we analyze things attributed to famous people that they didn't say at all. Sometimes there are famous quotes that have been mangled and changed or so greatly taken out of historical context that they might be considered misquotes. And occasionally, we talk about quotes that are genuine, but whose background illuminates a great deal more about the quote author and the times in which they lived, often the times in which the quote was said, than is usually realized. Today, I'd like to talk about a quote, a kind of poem that's become very famous since the end of World War II and the Holocaust. It's often employed in circumstances where there's been a violent outrage against a minority group while the majority either stood around and did nothing or looked the other way and more or less let it happen. That's why we've seen the poem used and posted so often on social media here in the United States in the past few weeks. You probably know it well. It's Pastor Martin Niemöller's First They Came. First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. That's the most well-known version and construction of this statement about the consequences of standing by while something immoral is happening, and about the responsibility of the bystanders. And it implies the burden of guilt that these bystanders live with in the wake of such events. Pastor Martin Niemöller was a German Lutheran pastor and a theologian who had a very intriguing and complex life. Born in 1892, the son of a Lutheran pastor, Niemöller's first career was as a submarine commander for the German Navy during World War I. Apparently, he was a pretty good sub-commander and was awarded the Iron Cross at the end of the war. Now, rather than stay in the Navy, he decided to become a pastor in the Lutheran Church after the war and was ordained in 1924. Now, given that he was the author of the famous First They Came poem, and I'm putting poem in quotation marks, and you'll see in a little while I'm doing that, it'll probably surprise many of you that he was an early supporter of Hitler and the National Socialists, the Nazis. Like a great many Lutheran pastors and churchmen, Niemöller was a social and political conservative,
and he had been greatly distressed by what he saw as the decline in German prestige in Europe after World War I. He thought that Hitler's emphasis on German national pride and Hitler's promises to bring about a recovery of its national pride and respect among European countries was what was needed. As the 1930s progressed, however, Niemöller became worried about the extremism that Hitler and the Nazis were displaying. Along with some other German Protestant leaders, such as Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he founded the Confessional Church in 1934. Its goal was to try to prevent German Protestant churches from becoming Nazified, that is, taken over by Nazi ideology. At this stage, however, Niemöller's worries were mainly centered around the Nazis taking over these churches. He had yet to become disillusioned with Nazi secular government goals and their ideas of national rebuilding. It took until 1936 for that to change. He gradually became more vocal and direct about his opposition to Nazi Aryanism. Consequently, he was arrested in 1937 when sent to Dachau concentration camp in 1938. He stayed there until the end of the war, when Dachau was liberated by the Allies in 1945. It's probably too much to say that the, quote, first they came idea was a product of Niemöller's arrest and imprisonment. But as far as we can tell, Dachau eventually had a lot to do with it. While driving his wife near Dachau just after the war, she asked to see his former cell. He took her there, and after seeing the cell, they were shown the crematorium by an American officer. As Niemöller said in 1946, "I stood there with my wife in front of the crematorium in Dachau, and on a tree in front of this building was a white painted board with black lettering. There one could read, 'Here in the years 1933 to 1945, 238,756 people were cremated.' While I read it, not aloud, I noticed that my wife fainted and sank trembling into my arms. I had to support her, and noticed at that moment a cold shudder ran down my spine. I think my wife fainted when she read the 250,000 number. And that hadn't moved me, because it didn't tell me anything new. What ran through me hot and cold at that moment was something else. That was the other two numbers, 1933 to 1945. I groped for my alibi and knew that the two numbers were the wanted poster for the living God for Pastor Niemöller. My alibi reached from 1937 to 1945. Yes, I know, from 1937 until the end, you had an alibi. Here's you being asked, where were you from 1933 until 1937? And I couldn't avoid this question any longer. Where were you from 1933 until 1937? A very powerful message to get from his own conscience. And this is where he obviously began to develop his idea of being responsible for rationalizing his own inaction in the face of an advancing menace. Effectively, he was asking himself how he could morally justify standing by while other groups were taken. As I implied above, he started talking about this realization in speeches and sermons in the later 1940s, both in Germany and during trips abroad. All the evidence indicates that Niemöller wove this experience and the questions he had asked himself into his speeches and sermons, but he hadn't turned them into the kind of poetic form that we know it today. That poetic form started to appear in the mid-1950s, and usually when the sentiment was repeated by other people, either in print or in their own speeches and sermons. American journalist Milton Sanford Meyer wrote about it in Harper's Magazine in 1953. American communist leader Claude Lightfoot paraphrased it in his own book, Not Guilty, in 1955, using a kind of poetic structure. And it was adapted like this in a school play in 1958. The school play was based on Anne Frank's diary. First they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Pretty close to the version that's so well known today. Since then, as you know, it's appeared many times and in many forms. Sometimes groups such as Catholics, Jehovah's Witnesses, the disabled, and many others are used. Indeed, Niemöller would use different groups in different speeches and different sermons. But the version that is so frequently heard and read in the United States since the 1960s replaced socialists for communists, as the first group mentioned. And in many German versions, Jews are not included. Academics have studied the poem, but Professor Harold Marcuse at the University of California, Santa Barbara has done, by far, the most extensive research and analysis of how the sentiment made its way from speech and sermon to poem, and how it's been used and reworded in different cultures. And I've relied very heavily on his work and on his translations of Niemöller's speeches when I was preparing this show. Taking communists out of the version used in Cold War America is not insignificant. Socialist was a less frightening term, a less dangerous group. There were socialists in Western Europe, after all, even in England. They were, a strange and vaguely un-American group, but not that deadly menace like the communists. In other cases, it seems as if the poem was adapted or changed to become more relevant or more palatable to specific audiences. As we've seen so often in our quote or no quote shows, that's far more common than not. And as we've seen in many of our other shows, the use of quotes, like the erection of a statue, says more about the people who are saying it in their own time and place than it does about the original historical speaker or historical context. When relating the story of his realization after seeing the dates on the cremation sign at Dachau, Niemöller mentioned the communists first because they were the first group rounded up by the Nazis in 1933. Again, rhetorically referring to himself being questioned by God, Niemöller said, "In 1933, I was a free man." 1933. At that moment in the crematorium yard, it occurred to me, yes, in 1933, that's right. Hermann Goering boasted publicly that he'd gotten rid of the communist danger. "Hey, Martin Niemöller, were you there then?" asked God. And on that day, the day he and his wife saw the sign at the Dachau crematorium, when we got home, I read the chapter Matthew 25 with new meaning. "I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was sick and in prison, and you did not come to me." As a Christian, I could have known and should have known in 1933 that in each of these human brothers, may they be called communists or whatever, God in Jesus Christ was asking me whether I wouldn't want to serve him. So that was the first expression of this sentiment, which is so powerful today. It's still so powerful today because the problems of abuse and oppression are still with us today. And when moral outrages happen, I wonder whether we aren't groping for alibis, as Niemöller said he did over and over from 1933 to 1937, when we retreat into the comfort of expressions of shock, of thoughts and prayers, and then we do nothing effective to try to stop these horrors from happening again. Have we created a culture where Niemöller's First They Came poem is so well known because it has to be? Talk to you next week.